feeding an evil cause.
Weapon of mass destruction.
A lot of true, dangerous hatred running through their veins.
But one of the robbers hides a secret that's not to be believed.
If this had been stumbled upon by someone in the group, those who were actually underground with him, I think probably would have killed him.
The FBI tries to stop a dangerous game of masquerade.
This case had everything: violence, white supremacy, and sex.
With a dramatic and twisted ending. June 1994, armed gunmen hit a bank in the Cincinnati suburb of Springdale.
Everybody hit the floor! This is a holdup! Get down on the ground or I'll shoot! Get down, now! You down! Down! What's the matter, you deaf? Get down! Get down! Move! Nobody talk, and everybody lives! 30 seconds! No alarms, no hostages. You understand me, sister? Good. Seconds. Come on, let's go! Ándale! Arriba! Arriba, babies! Yeah, La Bamba! Come on, let's go! Let's go! Go, 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 go! Go!
It's a clean getaway, except for a dye pack hidden inside the bills.
What's happening? I can't see!
We conducted an investigation at the scene, a preliminary investigation involving the forensics, lifted a number of latent prints, recovered the film from the bank camera, which later showed two suspects in Halloween masks. In fact, one of the masks was of an ex-president, former President Reagan. 4, 5, 6 days later, we did recover the getaway car, which was parked at a nearby office building. When our officers began to search the vehicle, they opened the glove box and did find what they believed at the time to be a live grenade.
While the grenade turns out to be a dummy, the FBI recognize it as the calling card of a robbery gang they have been tracking for months.
These robberies were primarily in the Midwest, and that's why the press gave them the name the Midwest Bank Bandits, which was appropriate. And it covered about a 6-state area between Ohio and Iowa.
We got together at several of the offices throughout the Midwest and FBI headquarters to try and discuss this group that was robbing banks throughout the Midwest.
It had become a bureau major case, which in the FBI is a big deal. So more resources were being poured into it, and it became a priority item. If you received the lead on that case, you got to it right away.
The FBI adds evidence from the Springdale robbery to its profile of the gang.
Their method of operation, their MO, was very effective. They were in, methodical, and out.
Most bank robberies today are very, very poorly planned. The Midwestern Bank Bandits would plan their robberies for weeks and sometimes months.
They did their planning, selecting banks that were accessible to interstates, that weren't cluttered with pedestrian traffic. They selected banks that they can get in quickly and get away quickly.
They specifically wore pretty extensive disguises to try and hide their identity.
That's what people remember. They tend not to notice other things like what kind of gun they were carrying, the clothing, and that kind of stuff.
They would do what are called takeover bank robberies. They didn't just walk in and hand them a note.
They come in with overpowering force.
Down! Now!
They went into the bank locked and loaded.
They never go to the vault. Too much burn time. They only do teller runs.
They never spent more than 90 seconds in a bank.
As a diversionary tactic, they would usually leave behind a bomb or an explosive device to delay the law enforcement authorities to enable them to escape.
The case was codenamed Bomb Rob, meaning that it was bank robberies that were using bombs in the commission of a robbery.
FBI agents actually started accumulating the evidence from the various robberies. They identified this group as the Midwest Bank Robbery Group, but they didn't know who the people were committing it.
We just knew them as a group of white bank robbers that had been robbing banks throughout the Midwest. We didn't have any name or names to attribute to them as suspects.
On the trail of the Midwest bank robbers, FBI agents get a break. Dye-stained bills traceable to the Springdale robbery have changed hands in the Cincinnati area.
Fortunately for myself at the time, some of the money that was given to me had that trace on it, and as I passed the money, it got picked up and noticed by authorities.
We initiated contact with Sean Kenny to attempt to find out if Sean had information about the gang.
Quite honestly, the first time that the FBI came to me, I was in no willing manner to want to help them.
Then, investigators get a tip to look at two of Kenny's associates, Peter Langen and Richard Guthrie.
We had received information that brought our attention to Langen and Guthrie, and the more we looked at them over this brief period in late '95, the better they looked.
Kenny had gotten to know Langen and Guthrie through the Cincinnati area white supremacist movement. Guthrie and Langen spent time in Elon City, which is an Oklahoma compound of white supremacists. They had spent time in the Aryan Nations compound in northern Idaho.
So they had a lot of true, dangerous hatred running through their veins.
Investigators dig deeper into the suspects' pasts and find that trouble had been brewing for a long time.
Peter Langen and Guthrie were two outcasts, basically losers, who met as teenagers in a high school in Wheaton, Maryland.
Peter Langen was the son of a CIA agent who played a significant role in the dark politics of South Vietnam. Langen grew up in the shadows of those sorts of covert operations and began to revere his father.
He grew up in Vietnam. He spoke different languages. He had an interesting background and an interesting sense of who he was and more than most kids, what the whole world was about.
When Langen returned to the United States, he had a lot of emotional problems, a lot of personal problems. His father died in 1967 in the midst of this. He dropped out of school early, and he learned to live by his own means and became sort of a street kid.
16-year-old Peter Langen flees to Florida and is quickly arrested for armed robbery and assaulting a police officer.
At this point in time, he's, I think, 5'6", 110 pounds, dripping wet, so he's a very vulnerable young fish in the Florida prison system. He becomes radicalized over the next 10 years of his life, escapes several times, and is brutalized several times. There's stories of his having been the victim of a rape more than once.
After Langen's release from prison, he reunites with his old school friend, Richard Guthrie, a Navy dropout and petty criminal.
Langen and Guthrie got together in the early 90s in Cincinnati, and then they went down to Georgia, robbed a Pizza Hut.
It resulted in Langen being arrested at that time. Guthrie was not.
At this time, though, the Secret Service became very interested in Guthrie. They had evidence that Guthrie had threatened the life of the President of the United States.
The Secret Service tries to get Langen to cooperate, but they end up getting duped.
Langen talked the Secret Service into thinking that he could help them track down Guthrie.
So the Secret Service talked to authorities in Georgia, got him out on bond to quote-unquote work with them, sent him back to Cincinnati to look for Mr. Guthrie.
For a couple of months, Langan led the Secret Service to believe that he was out looking for Guthrie.
In reality, he has found him, and there have been meetings between Guthrie and Langan.
They were making plans to go underground and start their spree of bank robberies.
Now, after the Springdale heist and Sean Kenny's tip, the FBI is eager to track down Langan and Guthrie.
Knowing that the Secret Service had interviewed Langan extensively, the FBI called this Secret Service agent, showed him some photos from a fifth bank robbery, and asked, could this possibly be Langan?
Photographs were shown to the Secret Service, and the word was that they didn't believe that it was them.
That resulted, for many months, in the FBI dropping Langan and Guthrie as suspects in the string of robberies.
With the FBI targets suddenly off their backs, Langan and Guthrie rob banks in Iowa, Missouri, and Kentucky. Flush with cash, the two men prepare for the next phase of their armed struggle.
We have the technology, materials necessary to make weapons of mass destruction.
The bank robberies were a means to an end.
They viewed themselves as revolutionaries.
And their idea was to commit bank robberies, to collect money, to ultimately overthrow the United States government.
After a string of successful bank robberies, Peter Langan and Richard Guthrie are ready to expand their terrorist organization.
Langan and Guthrie produced a recruiting video, essentially.
It is called The ARA Presents The Armed Struggle Underground.
Greetings. I'm Commander Pedro.
They planned to send these videos out to white supremacist leaders throughout the country. As a matter of fact, when the FBI raided some lockers and safe houses that these guys had rented, they found about 9 or 10 of these videos packed in envelopes with the addresses of white supremacist leaders throughout the country.
I'm here to talk about the armed struggle underground.
They all had names. Langan was Commander Pedro, and Guthrie went by Commander Pavel.
My name is Commander Pavel, and I'm with the Aryan Republican Army.
Basically, they spewed out anti-black, anti-Jewish diatribes and urged Americans to join the revolution.
We understand the meaning of ethnic cleansing. We shall not be deceived by lying preachers, paid storytellers, Judeo-Christian garbage.
The bulk of it, to a casual observer, would probably look kind of silly.
We basically have 3 objectives: eliminate the government, exterminate Jaime, and repatriate all non-whites with their lands. That's it.
Langan even created these elaborate commercials. Blammo Ammo, I think he called one of them.
The Aryan Republican Army Presents is brought to you by Blammo Ammo Company. When the feds come for a picnic, you want to give them a spicy lead meatball.
After you listen to the message, the comedy wears away, and it became a very actually frightening video once you thought about the fact that these men really believed what they were saying.
The video is sophomoric in a way, almost comical.
Caramba, grande dinero.
Until you realize that the guys who made it and the guns that they're holding up are real guns, are real assault rifles, and these guys are real bank robbers.
ARA is coming to a town near you soon.
The FBI had recently faced off with anti-government groups at Waco and Ruby Ridge. They now feared the Midwest bank robbers could reach the same level of violence.
I see you boys had a good mission.
The robbers send some of their proceeds to Mark Thomas, Pennsylvania preacher and renowned white supremacist. In return, Thomas finds 2 skinheads willing to join the gang, Kevin McCarthy and Scott Stediford. Bigger, stronger, and more disciplined than ever, the gang hits 6 more banks, walking away with $100,000. They taunt their pursuers and turn terrorism into entertainment.
They had a remarkable sense of humor. They would rob a bank, and Langan would go out the door and say, "Thank you very much. Thanks for the memories."
They would say, "Andale, andale."
Arriba, arriba, babies. Yeah, la bamba.
Or some other kind of gibberish to try and throw off their nationality.
They walked into one bank to rob it, and Langan is dressed as Santa Claus, walking in the bank, drawing children around him, ho, ho, ho. And underneath his costume, he's got a .45 caliber pistol and a hand grenade.
In fact, in some of their bank robberies, they would wear shirts that were stenciled with FBI or ATF on them.
These were all attempts to tweak or to thumb their nose at the agents who were after them.
The more banks they rob, the bolder they become.
They used people's names in law enforcement to buy some of the getaway cars.
One of the gang's getaway cars was registered to an FBI agent who'd arrested another white supremacist robbery gang years before.
It gave us an indication that these were individuals that knew something about the right wing.
That connection was followed by another, more surprising one.
Get down on the ground or I'll shoot!
Langan and Guthrie's crimes resembled the work of America's most notorious bank robber.
The historical parallels between the Midwest bank bandits and Jesse James and that era are accurate. I mean, the mechanics of the bank robberies are essentially the same.
Go back and study the banks that Jesse James hit, and you'll find that these guys went the same route.
As Langan and Guthrie continued their spree, they also took time to write letters to newspapers taunting the FBI and bragging about the robberies.
Jesse James did the same thing. Jesse James, he set out his own press notices. And Richard Guthrie used to write letters to the editors of towns where he'd robbed banks, talking about his exploits.
He even had little business cards made up.
The business card said, "ARA coming to a town near you soon."
I think they saw themselves as white supremacist revolutionaries who thumbed their nose at authority, sort of trying to show the American public that you can thumb your nose at authority and get away with it.
After a dozen or so of these robberies, the Aryan Republican Army was actually rolling in clover. Individually, they had more cash than maybe ever before. So they began on individual projects. Stediford's idea was to produce his own CD. The band is called Day of the Sword. The album would be called Ear to Ear, as in slit a pig from ear to ear.
The greatest crime that goes untold is not the murder of our people, but of the Aryan soul.
Folk singers from Woody Guthrie to Bob Dylan have talked about robbing banks to the sixth gun, but nobody ever did it. You know, Stediford did it. Not only did he do it, but he used the money to create a unique form of rock and roll, terrorism rock.
Race against time, fight or die!
While Stediford channels his money into his music, Langan engages in an even stranger pursuit.
By this time, Langan is a very interesting character. During the day, he's dressed as a commando and he's pulling off bank robberies as Commander Pedro of the Aryan Republican Army. During the night, he's known as Donna, where he's a drag queen in Kansas City, and he's dressed in pearls and blue lame and high heels, and he's begun to court all of these other transsexuals and has really begun to find himself in the transsexual community. Langan wanted to use his money for a sex change operation.
First time I met Peter, he was dressed as Donna. Peter told me that I was meeting him like at the crossroads of his life. He was like he was changing horses in midstream.
Very, very strange. Something that the group didn't know about.
This is a hyper-masculine social movement. This went against everything that they had been taught.
If this had been stumbled upon by someone in the group, or myself or anyone, those who were actually underground with him, I think probably would have went to more serious means and probably had killed him.
Not only does Langan keep his secret from the gang, he leads them on even more daring robberies.
I was in the office and a bank robbery was reported at the Columbus National Bank, and I was one of the agents that responded to the scene.
Stay down! Stay down! Don't move!
Langan had chosen to wear a ski mask, and then over the ski mask a pair of sunglasses, and then on his head a construction worker's hard hat. The latter two items were totally irrelevant and non-functional. They were there only for style. Langan bounds over the counter, smacks his knee, and this causes the hard hat to hit the sunglasses and to fall and cover his eyes. And in frustration, he rips the whole thing off. A teller named Lisa Copley identifies this robber. And this is the first time that we get a physical ID of one of the Midwestern Bank bandits.
The gang leaves a bomb to delay investigators. Like Langan himself, the device is a perverse combination of whimsy and malice.
They left the bomb behind in a lunchbox with a pack of Twinkies on top of it.
In this case, it did not look like a hoax device. It was a pipe bomb with nails around it.
By now, the gang had started using more menacing explosives with increasingly deadly power.
The bomb squad had to take care of it.
The gang gets away, but nets only $3,400. Although they've pulled off 20 robberies by now, life underground is beginning to take its toll.
Guthrie had alienated everybody in the gang toward the end, and it really turned out to be a lousy bank robber. One of those reasons is he was showing up to these robberies drunk on tequila. Well, this isn't going to last long with his cohorts, right? So before you know it, they begin to have a falling out.
So what Guthrie was started to do in December of 1995, he wanted to form another gang as himself as the leader. And what he did, he got hold of Sean Kenny, wanted to recruit him into the gang.
But little does Guthrie know, his old friend has already been talking to the FBI.
What we were looking for were who could we interview, who could we contact, who knew Langan and Guthrie. And this one name came up. My supervisor made the decision to send me down to Georgia to interview this fella who we believed at least knew or had a previous relationship with Langan and Guthrie.
Investigators pay a return visit to Sean Kenny, who had been caught passing money from the Springdale robbery. Kenny had left Cincinnati and joined the Army.
I went down to Fort Benning and interviewed Sean for the first time.
The key thing he told me was, I'm a straight shooter. I'm going to be straight with you. If you're straight with me, you won't have any problems.
He had made a decision for himself and his family, a good one, and was trying to make the best of it.
Our oldest son was born. He was severely handicapped. That was a big turning point in my life and made me reevaluate my belief system. It didn't fit as far as my ideology that I had had. In a perfect Aryan world, blonde hair, blue eyes, and all this, someone of my son's nature would be considered undesirable, not acceptable.
He understood that continuing with Langan and Guthrie would lead to no good.
As far as they knew, I was still ideologically backing them and behind them, but realistically was more inclined to support my family at the time.
Woods shows Kenny some composite sketches of the Midwest bank robbers.
Those sketches were very familiar to likenesses of Pete and Rich, and I testify to that fact.
I was able to get Sean on administrative leave, and he came up to Cincinnati. We had no way of locating Langan and Guthrie at that point. He was the only person who knew people who may be able to get in touch or at least locate them.
I went around to people in the movement that I knew, friends and associates that may have seen them, places that we had gone to.
I spent many, many hours with Sean during that period, and I learned a lot about him, where he came from, what he thought, what his beliefs were.
Kenny took a big risk in cooperating. These guys were very violent. They were nuts.
We will deal with informers. And we will deal with them ruthlessly, permanently, and effectively.
If Richard Guthrie or Pete Langen had found out that I was talking to the FBI, they were in a position that I'm sure they would have probably tried to do away with me. I guess it was towards the end of my time period up here and getting a little anxious that nothing was panning out when Richard Guthrie contacted me.
I remember very vividly getting a call late one night that he had just met with Richard Lee Guthrie.
The FBI, I guess they thought it was too good to be true. They immediately wanted me to come down to the FBI office and talk about this development.
Kenny is given a lie detector test and fails.
I became very defiant and said, I'm meeting him tomorrow. Either you be there and you can catch him, or don't believe me and fine, I'll just go on back home.
Ed Woods is alone in trusting Kenny.
He had believed me that I'd made contact and I was being very truthful and forthcoming with the FBI.
Woods convinces them to go ahead with the plan and follow Kenny to the meeting.
We waited. I think it was 2 o'clock. Nobody showed up. We didn't hear anything.
I got a little nervous because the time when me and Guthrie were supposed to meet had came and went.
And then close to 5, Guthrie called and made arrangements to meet Sean at another location.
Woods and the rest of the surveillance team race to the new rendezvous point. En route, Woods spots Guthrie in a van and turns to follow him.
Guthrie's driving this van that's been beaten to hell and back across the country robbing banks, and the compression on it is shot, so it can only go 40 miles an hour, not much of a getaway.
I made the decision that we were going to do a felony car stop. I turned on the light and siren to attempt to pull Guthrie over, but he continued. Then he made this first right turn, and as soon as he made the turn, I was right behind him. He probably realized when I did that he had turned into a cul-de-sac. I just turned into him, accelerated, and smashed into his van right about here. He bounced off the windshield, but bailed out of the van. My supervisor and I chased him down the hill, yelling for him to stop. He stopped, he turned, and I guess he could see all the other agents behind us. And it seemed like he was trying to make a decision whether or not he was going to shoot it out and end it all right there. He surrendered. We handcuffed him, patted him down, and took a loaded weapon off him.
Woods takes Richard Guthrie to the FBI office in Cincinnati for interrogation.
It didn't take Guthrie long to become a government informant. Within several hours, he had admitted his crimes, told them about Stediford, identified McCarthy, and identified Mark Thomas, the white supremacist leader.
Guthrie ultimately tells us that Langen is probably at the safe house that they had identified at 585 Reinhardt in Columbus, Ohio.
One thing, though, Guthrie warned them, do not barge into that house. That house is full of gunpowder, grenades, and chemicals. Wait until Langen is outside that house, because that house could become another Waco.
FBI agent Ed Woods readies himself. The 2-year manhunt for bank robber and terrorist Peter Langen is coming to a climax. Richard Guthrie has directed agents to the gang's safe house in Columbus, Ohio.
The decision is made, obviously, very quickly to send the SWAT team to Columbus in an attempt to draw up a plan to arrest Langen. During this time, Guthrie is telling us Langen had bulletproof vests, that he had bombs, that he had guns, and that he was not going to be taken alive.
We didn't want a hostage situation. We didn't want a siege situation. We were going to wait out Langen until he came out of the house.
Agent Woods takes up position a short distance from the safe house.
We parked here for the first maybe hour and a half as the neighborhood started to come to life. Kids are going to school. Of course, we're all armed with semi-automatics. I had a Glock 40 caliber at that time.
I had a 12-gauge shotgun.
They noticed Langan at about 9 o'clock in the morning leaving the house, dressed in black, 2 layers of clothes, carrying a bag, walking toward his van. He gets to the van, opens the door, throws the bag in, and looks both ways, sits behind the wheel, and starts the engine.
The driver's door closed, he's in the van.
SWAT team leader made the decision that rather than get him moving, that it might be better to arrest Langan stationary in his vehicle.
Move up.
And so we moved in to make that arrest.
At this point, we rolled up, came to a stop. There was another Bureau vehicle right here.
Myself and Special Agent Bevan Stauffer were in the vehicle closest to the white Chevy van.
Langan in the white van was surrounded by the SWAT team. My supervisor, Dave Welker, ran over to the corner of the garage. I ran over to here.
Agents Jeff Lindsay and Mike Erbach took up a position at the corner of the garage closest to Langan's vehicle. Several other vehicles pulled in behind us. An agent took up a position near a light pole. Individuals began yelling out commands for Langan to raise his hands and come out of the vehicle.
Go ahead and move up, John. He is in the van. The door is closed. You want to move up at the front? Go ahead.
Langan made a decision not to get out, but to resist. They saw him with his right hand reach across his body to the left-hand side hip. And as he did that, he swirled around and jumped in the back of the van.
Langan then, after diving to the back of the van, comes up in a two-handed shooting stance with his hands pointed in the direction of Jeff Lindsay and Mike Erbach.
Jeff Lindsay had a shotgun and he fired first.
I hear some shots and then I fired at Langan. 3 rounds of double-aught buck from the shotgun that I was carrying.
The FBI fired at Mr. Langan 45 times.
The shots quickly stopped. Langan's no longer there.
They yelled for him to come out, although quite honestly, not one of them believed he would. They were sure that they had shot him.
But just a few seconds later, we hear Langan say, "I've got a head wound, I've got a head wound."
And Langan was taken out of the van and laid down here, searched, handcuffed, and it looked to me like he was seriously injured.
There was a piece of shotgun wadding stuck below his eye, and there was blood coming down his face.
While Langan is rushed to the hospital, agents search the van and safe house.
This was by far the biggest arsenal of ammunition, weapons, pipe bombs that I had encountered in one location. They had several thousand rounds of ammunition, many, many firearms.
At the hospital, Agent Woods discovers Langan's shocking secret.
While they were working on Langan in the emergency room, I couldn't help but to observe that Langan had, I think it was pink toenail polish, and he was shaved, and I thought that was kind of strange for a white supremacist to be looking like that in the emergency room.
He was a pre-operative transsexual.
My being arrested in Columbus was not an arrest, it was kind of like a botched assassination attempt.
On television, suspected serial bank robber Peter Langan insists he's innocent.
If I'm going to be tried, I'd like to be tried in a court of law with rules of evidence. I am innocent. I hurt. I'm in pain.
Richard Guthrie, incarcerated in Cincinnati, agrees to cooperate with the FBI. But the night before he's scheduled to testify against Langan, he hangs himself with a bedsheet.
With Richard Guthrie killing himself, it stepped me up as the next key witness for the prosecutors.
Assistant U.S. Attorneys Robin Hainert and Dana Peters start building their case against Langan.
The evidence was extensive. We had evidence from Peter Langen's storage locker in Kansas, evidence from the safe house in Columbus, Ohio, the evidence taken from the bank, videotapes. All told, I think we went through almost 1,000 different exhibits potentially to be used and narrowed it down from there.
Much of that evidence was submitted to the FBI laboratory for testing, and then a number of the FBI agents introduced all this physical evidence that tied into the robberies.
This is a Halloween mask of Ronald Reagan. It was the mask that was worn during the Springdale bank robbery. This next item here is the packet of Twinkies that were found inside the lunchbox from the Columbus National Bank robbery.
So all of that type of physical evidence was utilized as signature evidence. They were unique to these robberies, and that's what helped us tie Langen and Guthrie to committing them.
One of the more interesting angles was Langen's strategy to paint himself as this almost pacifist, non-aggressive kind of person. And the way he did that was calling two of his lovers from Kansas as defense witnesses.
It seemed like Peter's inner personality was basically good, even though he had made some huge mistakes in his life. We were so happy. Sometimes you can't put happiness into words.
His defense then was to try to portray himself that I'm not this person the government's portraying. How could you say that I would be part of the Aryan Republican Army because I am a transsexual? I am completely the direct opposite of what a white supremacist should be.
How can you believe that I would be a white supremacist? Because I actually have a totally different lifestyle. I want to be a woman. I want to be with men. In addition to being a very dark individual, he is a very intelligent individual.
I can't understand how anyone could hate as much as Peter Kevin Langen hated other people simply because of the color of their skin or the religion that they followed.
There's usually something redeemable in people. There is nothing redeemable in Peter Kevin Langen.
Based on the overwhelming evidence, the jury quickly returns a verdict.
Langen was convicted and was ultimately given a life sentence plus 35 years.
Have anything to do with any of those other bank robberies?
After the trial, prosecutors remained skeptical that Langen's transsexual identity was anything but a ruse.
The prosecutors were always suspicious of his claims to be a transsexual. But frankly, I think that might have been his true nature. After he was convicted, he wanted the Bureau of Prisons to conduct a sex change on him. That's pretty radical stuff for a guy who's faking it.
I do not believe that that is anything but a cover. My fear was that he was going to use that sex change operation as a way to escape from prison.
Donna wrote this to me from prison. She says to me, I want to be your Valentine because, oh baby, you're so fine. I am your wife and I love you for life. It says Donna loves Alex.
Langen is currently serving his sentence in a federal prison. The government has refused to pay for his gender reassignment surgery.
Scott Stediford faced trial in Iowa and was convicted on one of the bank robberies. Kevin McCarthy and Mark Thomas pled guilty to a conspiracy to commit bank robbery charge out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Even in big cases like this, there are some bright spots. The situation with Sean is certainly one of them. Here was a kid who recognized that he was going down the wrong path, went in another direction, and did it very successfly. He didn't want to be a criminal for the rest of his life. He didn't want to wind up in jail.
Despite their low-life lifestyle, they were good bank robbers. They taunted authorities, robbed 21 banks. garnered $250,000 worth of loot out of those banks. John Dillinger, back in the 30s, only operated for about 10 months. These guys operated for 2 years and never got caught robbing a bank.
The Midwest Bank Bandits were kind of one of the high points of the history of bank robberies. I mean, there have been a number of gangs over the years, but this is one of the more modern versions of legitimate bank robbery gangs.
One of the lessons for any would-be bank robbers is if you taunt the FBI or local law enforcement, they're just going to work maybe that extra hour or two a day to bring you down.